So welcome to the second session of Making the Leap to Large. I'm Susan Winter at the School of Information, the University of Maryland.
And I'm Joel Cutcher-Gershenfeld at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University.
And I'm Nick Berente. I'm at the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame.
John King. I'm at the School of Information at the University of Michigan. So I'll jump right into the overview. So there is a precedence to these 7 sessions, but it's not a precedence of importance. It's a precedence of intent or timing, if you think about it that way. Today's session on stakeholder alignment relates to all of the subsequent sessions. All the subsequent sessions build on it and build on our 4 dimensions of impact. And as with each session, we start with a video. Joel?
Super. And I will connect you to the video.
Making the leap from a small scientific project to a large NSF science and engineering initiative is a considerable undertaking. Take scientist Lucy, for example. She does computational chemistry. She knows the key stakeholders, her collaborators, colleagues, students, department head, funder review panels, program officer, conference program committees, and journal paper reviewers. If Lucy wants to make the leap to large, she's going to need to involve many more stakeholders over the next 4 or more years. Teams of researchers coming from diverse disciplines and universities, each with their own stakeholder group. Next generation scholars, including those from underrepresented groups. Data professionals providing cyber infrastructure for large-scale research. Multiple universities' IRBs wanting to review her data collection from stakeholders. Campus commercialization folks and intellectual property managers wondering if Lucy's ideas have economic value. Other researchers and citizen scientists looking to build on Lucy's research in ways that she can't even imagine. Industry leaders wanting to capitalize on any commercial value, and policymakers estimating the value to society of this large-scale project. These additional stakeholders have interests that can pull Lucy in many directions. It is a bit overwhelming. What Lucy needs is a stakeholder map so she can see the full landscape of stakeholders and interests. She needs to create ways to engage with all the stakeholders early on, not just managing expectations, but understanding how to provide value for each of the different stakeholders. She needs a deep understanding of how the many stakeholders' interests, knowledge, expertise, data, and other resources can, and in some cases must, shape her research in ways that advance both intellectual merits and broader impacts. Lucy is no longer just doing science, she is leading science. In making the leap to large, you too can accomplish better, more impactful science, aligning diverse stakeholders for success. So, let's focus on what you need to know about stakeholders.
Super.
So we're going to go on to the pre-session survey results. And we're going to go over these somewhat quickly. Okay, the next one says, these are just some of the things that the people reported. So most of the people attended the first session, or they're going to the recordings of the first session and seen those. Next slide. Between half and 2/3, kind of like the general scheme. Interest in some of the subsequent issues tailed off a little bit after that, but they're kind of tied to the things that people like. We have some dialing in to do, we know that. and your feedback is very valuable. So thank you. Next. These are what people appreciated. They appreciate the framework, the dimensions of impact. They appreciate the keynote talk that we had last time, Dr. Savage, his proposal examples, the things that he thought were important, the focus on enterprise, the focus on non-science activities, and people had logistics concerns, which we understand and we're working on. Next. This is what people want. They want links, they want examples, they want review comments from NSF and from NIH and others so that they can improve their proposals, and we're working on those things. They want improved logistics, particularly in the breakout rooms. So there's some additional information on the breakout rooms today. And we were kind of hit unexpectedly, first of all, by the pandemic and also the size of the interest in this. So the breakout rooms were the kind of last thing that had to be fixed. We know that from the early word cloud that people don't want to be bombarded with extra work to do. So we're mindful of that. And people want to learn about how to work with stakeholders. So today's session deals with stakeholders. In subsequent sessions, we'll deal with environment, economics, impacts of various kinds, DEI, workforce, etc. With that, I'll hand it off to Susan, and we'll begin stakeholder alignment.
Thank you. So in this section, Joel and I will be doing a bit of tag teaming. Today's topic is stakeholder alignment. Next slide. The stakeholder alignment in the context of the 4 dimensions of impact that we talked about last week. And that's because the stakeholders will play an important role in enabling you to have these impacts. Next slide. So in the survey, you told us that as a successful researcher, you're already pretty good at working with stakeholders in your small and medium projects. That's the set of lines at the top. And then there's a bit of a break. Doing a large actually requires working with a broader and more diverse set of stakeholders. And you told us that you have a lot less experience in working with such a broad group. Next slide. So shown graphically, as you remember from the video, you're going to move from considering the interests of a small group of stakeholders to considering the interests of a much wider set of and more diverse set of stakeholders. Now, we know that you can't actually connect directly to all of them. That's just too many people to oversee. So you'll be delegating some of those connections, but you'll ultimately be responsible for making sure that it all gets done. And we see in this slide that there were only a couple of aspects of working with stakeholders that the majority of you said that you did well. One-on-one interest-based dialogue and constructing a shared vision. And that was only just a majority, a bare majority of you. Significantly fewer felt that you did well on other things, which fortunately are the things that we'll be covering today or in future sessions. Things like mapping stakeholders and developing value propositions. Next slide. We also saw considerable diversity in the aspects that you'd like to improve on, but there was no option that received an absolute majority. Today, we'll be working on the top 2 and touch a little bit on the 4th one. So mapping the landscape of stakeholders and interests, specifying value propositions, constructing a shared vision. Next week, we'll be working on the 3rd, the providing common metrics. So there's progress visible for your stakeholders, and we'll touch on others later. Now back to Joel to talk a little about the conceptual roots and process of stakeholder alignment with an interesting example.
Thanks, Susan. To start with, the whole idea of aligning stakeholders to have collective impact is hard. And there's a lot of literature documenting just how hard it is. In 1911, Robert Michel introduced the idea of the iron law of oligarchy, that a small group of people, once in power, will tend to only focus on sustaining their role rather than sharing power. Manker Olson documented how individual self-interest can often supersede collective interest. And Garrett Hardeen pointed out that there are these tragedies of the commons where common pool resources get underdeveloped. These are just some of the ways in which getting a large group of stakeholders aligned around a science enterprise has dynamics that can undercut success. Having said that, there's hope. In 1933, Mary Parker Follett delivered the inaugural election for the business school at the London School of Economics. Remarkable that a female economist was considered the top world's economist to do that. But more important, what she said was the idea of integration, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Eleanor Ostrom pointed out that you can overcome tragedies of the commons with public-private partnerships, new institutional arrangements. And Anita Hill, who really introduced into society the very idea of sexual harassment as something that crystallized as a colleague of mine at Brandeis, she's been asked to lead the Hollywood Commission following #MeToo, in which she's organizing collective stakeholders around setting policies, protocols, and procedures to mitigate the harm of sexual harassment in Hollywood, doing the kind of collective action that we're talking about in society. And if we go back to Mary Parker Follett, she had an important idea. She said that when you have folks who disagree, you can have one dominate the other or both compromise. In one case, one wins, and the other, neither wins. But she said this third idea of integration, in fact, creates something new that neither thought of. And since then, in the negotiations field, we've learned that people often get stuck on positions. And if you get to the underlying interests, you can find those integrative solutions. And that's what we're going to do with some tools for stakeholder mapping. What we're going to do is share with you a very simple but crucial model of 5 steps in the process of mapping stakeholders associated with large-scale science and engineering projects. And again, with the tag team, we're going to go back and forth, Susan and I, on this, but it's all going to be in the context of a unique example. A few years ago, with NSF support, a group of historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, HSIs, and tribal colleges and universities, TCUs, formed a cyber infrastructure consortium to accomplish together what they couldn't do separately. We've done 2 stakeholder maps with them, one 2 years ago in formation and one just recently as they're moving along. And the second one was supported by Internet 2 as well. And there were a number of very basic needs that they identified, some shared interest in workforce development, a need to collaborate, and a desire as minority voices to bring forth societal impact issues with data that advance their interest. So let's use that as an example as we walk through the 5 steps. Back to you, Susan.
Thanks, Joel. So the first step is to brainstorm all the stakeholders that can affect your success. So this is about specifying the stakeholders. Next slide. This is essentially a creative thinking exercise. So it's helpful to do it as a group. It's helpful to do it iteratively and to integrate as many perspectives as possible so that you won't overlook any important stakeholders. So as a leadership team, you're going to want to think about categories of relevant stakeholders. You're going to want to bring in additional perspectives on this, your colleagues, affiliates, stakeholder representatives, to really review the categories and think about what might be missing there. And then review everything that you've generated in terms of your brainstorming so that you combine the list and compare it against the 4 dimensions of impact to see if there are other areas that you might not have considered. So again, it's a creative thinking exercise. You want to do it as a group. You want to do it iteratively. You want to integrate as many perspectives as possible. And think about who can influence your impact in the 4 areas that we talked about before: the science, the workforce, the economic, and the innovation. And our keynote speaker has some great insights into this. When the Minority Serving Cyber Infrastructure Consortium took on this challenge, they identified 4 kinds of institutions that were stakeholders. So that included historically Black colleges and universities, the HBCUs, the tribal colleges and universities, other minority serving institutions. They also identified different kinds of individuals at an institution that could play a role as a stakeholder. So the educators or the researchers, faculty and staff, the cyber infrastructure professionals, because this is the Cyber Infrastructure Consortium, and senior administrative leadership, the president, the CIO, the CTO. And they thought it was important to consider the number of years of experience that an individual had. One thing to note is that in identifying the stakeholders are people or groups or organizations that have a stake, and that can change over time. So it's not like you just identify these once and you're done. You're going to want to keep this in mind and keep it refreshed periodically. Next slide. So the second step is to identify each stakeholder's interests. So what do they value? What do they care about? Next slide. Remember, this is about what they care about. It's not about what you care about. It's also not about what you wish they would care about. This is about what they care about. So for each of the stakeholders, you want to identify 3 to 5 interests that are at stake. What are their values? What are their hopes? What are their fears? What are their impacts they care about? And there are lots of ways of figuring this out, but the most direct one is to actually ask them, to check with the stakeholder representatives and with other people to confirm these lists, to make sure that your instincts and your information is correct. So you want to have for a sample position, faculty members like to be listed as a co-author. Their interests are in career advancement and credit for contributions and teamwork. I always tell my students I'm in it for the fame, the glory, the money. These are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about. Why are they interested in this? What do they care about?
And I might add that if you just focus on the positions, you're likely to have more of a claiming game. But if you get beyond positions to why is that important, then you understand what the underlying interests are. So being able to ask your stakeholders, help me to understand why that's important to you, is a way of getting at those interests.
Absolutely. And we see when the Minority Serving Cyber Infrastructure Consortium asked about interests, they were able to sort them into related categories. So they came up with some application interests like science and engineering and workforce development. They also came up with some cyber infrastructure interests. They thought that the infrastructure for their campus would be improved. They'd improve cybersecurity. They could get more research funding, but it would also help with recruiting and retaining faculty and students. And they had broader interest in strengthening the minority serving college and institution movement. It's also interesting to note, important to note, that sometimes your stakeholders' interests will diverge. So in terms of collaboration, in this example, there were a set of stakeholders that actively wanted to share research data and computing, and a set that really didn't want to share. And these can be areas of tension that you're going to need to manage. And these relevant interests are dynamic and they can change during the life of a research enterprise. So it's worth keeping an eye out for when situations change, when interests change, and continuing to refresh and update this. And now back to Joel.
Thanks. We're going to go to step 3. Up until now, you've had dialogue both internally with your team and externally with stakeholders to say, who are the stakeholders and what's at stake? What are their interests? But we want you to go further, and you can do so with different degrees of intensity in constructing your stakeholder map. At the very least, you want to be able to say, what are all of the interests that are at stake, in a sense, compiling what you've heard from different stakeholders. You might do focus groups to fully explore those. You might do a stakeholder mapping survey to see how important or difficult these issues are for your stakeholders. You might look to find where are they aligned or misaligned. And we're going to show you some ways to visually represent it, but we encourage you to be creative. You're not limited in any regard by what we share, but we just want to illustrate the point, again, with the Minority Serving Consortium. So if we take the same interest that Susan shared with you, there were a number of applications. I only have 4 of them here, but you could see that on a scale from 0 to 10, all of them were important. And in fact, there was no one interest of applications of cyber infrastructure that stood out. So we had to think of it as an ensemble. If you look at the issue of different parts of the infrastructure, notice that all of these were rated higher even than the applications. And this included not just the cyber professionals, but other stakeholders were saying you need to have cybersecurity. This needs to help bring in research funding and other things. You can see, though, that some things were more difficult, such as using cybersecurity to recruit and retain. And finally, when we asked them about how important was it to work together and collaborate versus everyone do their own thing, there was a clear preference to work together. So now we're starting to see the landscape of where folks are aligned or misaligned. And you can take the same data and break it out. So you can break it out by categories. So around the active sharing versus little or no sharing, you can see that pretty much everybody said the sharing was important but difficult to do, versus the little or no sharing, particularly our cyber professionals and administrators did not see that as important, a 5.8 and 5.9 on a scale of 0 to 10. Some of our researchers, though, did see sharing as being, perhaps not sharing being more important. So that gives you a clue that there are pockets of teachers and researchers who are not inclined to share. So you're starting to see more about the landscape. As it happens, we've developed a conceptual tool. It's just one example of illustrating things in which we think of this whole landscape as a matrix with stakeholders on one side and interest on the other. So mathematically, each interest has a vector of stakeholders. This is a heat map where green is positive, yellow is negative, red is negative, yellow is neutral. And each stakeholder comes with a vector of interest, if you will. In order to make it visual, we actually start in the middle with the mean. And on the right, you can see we tile them above the mean and below the mean as hexagons, one for literally every respondent to a survey, every stakeholder. So this is not just looking at the mean, but seeing the entire array. And the outside is, of course, the outliers. The middle is the central tendency. So let's look at a couple of these. We call them Z-flowers because we sometimes use Z-scores in constructing them. But let's go back to the MSCC, the Minority Serving Initiative. When we ask them, how important is it for everyone to share together? You can see on the top row, the HBCUs, the Hispanic Serving, and the TCUs all had people that said it was important. But notice there are a few outliers who say it's not important. So you need to be mindful that if we can see all respondents, all stakeholders, that it's not all unified. Of course, when we said how easy is it how to do, most people said it's hard. Those are red. And by the way, we can do these for people who are colorblind with other color schemes. But notice that there are some bright spots. There are some folks that says it's not hard. And there you want to lean in and understand more of what are those stories. By contrast, when we said, should there be no sharing, a lot of people said no, and then a lot said yes. So it's bimodal. And particularly on the difficulty, we get a much more complicated picture on the fact that some people are oriented to sharing and some are not. So I'm going to stop there. That just gives us a little bit of a sense of different ways to visualize and represent stakeholders. The important point is being able to step back and see where those points of tension or misalignment, as well as points of alignment, might be. Once you have that, you can begin to construct value propositions for your stakeholders. Now, a value proposition is something that is a concise statement, literally, of what's at stake for the stakeholders on your project. And essentially, you want to think through how do you communicate to your whole team and to others your understanding of what stakeholders are looking for from your project. Like Susan was sharing with the others, we have a worksheet here that gives you some prompts, but let's show you an example. Again, with the Minority Serving Consortium, they identified a number of stakeholders. This is just one of them, their industry partners. And they had a short statement of that they want to coordinate with them. And there are certain topics around which they want to coordinate, where they anticipate the stakeholders will want to coordinate. Industry will want to talk to them about new technology, services, resources, and next generation talent. That's just one of, in fact, 6 major stakeholder categories that they identified. And in each one, they basically said to the stakeholder, here's what we're doing for you, understanding your interest. And of course, it's a dynamic process of making sure that they continue to be aligned. But their challenge as an initiative is to keep in mind not just what they want to accomplish, but what each stakeholder is looking to learn or achieve or gain from them. And that's what their value propositions are doing. Back to you, Susan.
Thanks, Joel. And the final step is to construct a shared vision. The majority of you, as you may recall, said that you do this fairly well, but making the leap to large means constructing a vision that speaks to a more diverse group of stakeholders. Next slide. And again, with a worksheet, what you'll note here is that constructing a shared vision requires forging consensus around a motivating view of the future. And both pieces of this are important. It needs to be both shared and motivating. And one of the big challenges in large science and engineering is trying to construct this with a more diverse group of stakeholders. But it's important to reach consensus, or at least shared consensus among a set of the stakeholders, and to be able to motivate to be able to move forward. Next slide. The Minority Serving Cyberinfrastructure Consortium came up with a vision that focused on, again, envisioning, that's about the future, a transformational partnership to promote advanced cyber infrastructure capabilities on the campuses with data, research, computing, teaching, curriculum development, and implementation. Those are the details. They said that they wanted to continue to learn and grow as a consortium, and that they were, here's a motivating part, dedicated to lifting all participating institutions by advancing cyber infrastructure across diverse fields, disciplines, and communities, and committed to engaging as full contributors to the global research and education community. Next slide. So motivating visions of the future, where do you come up with them? They can be formulated as grand challenges, as we see here for engineering, advanced personalized learning, make solar energy economical, securing cyberspace, or next slide, they can be formulated as big ideas, as NSF has called them. These are motivating visions. Next slide. So following these 5 steps will help you successfully make the leap to large by identifying the stakeholders, developing value propositions so that you can deliver the significant impact to science, workforce development, economic benefit, and innovation that's key to successfully making the leap to large. And now my colleague Nick Berente is going to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Kate Keehee, who's going to provide some additional interesting examples of how she's accomplished this. Nick?
Yes, thanks, Susan. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kate Keehee, a senior computer scientist at Argonne National Laboratory and the University of Chicago's Consortium for Advanced Science and Engineering. Dr. Keehee is one of the pioneers of cloud computing infrastructure. She created the Nimbus project, which is the first among the first open source implementations of infrastructure as a service. And she also co-founded the Software X Journal, which is a particularly innovative journal. It publishes software as a scientific instrument. And she is currently the principal investigator of the Chameleon project. And this is a project that provides deeply reconfigurable, large scale, and open experimental platform for computer science research. So with that said, it's my pleasure to welcome Kate Keehee.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, fantastic. As Nick mentioned, I work on cloud computing and resource management. Within cloud computing, that's my area of research, but I also work a lot on building scientific instruments, right? And scientific instruments give you new capabilities to probe the frontiers of science. And so they are a scientific problem in themselves, in that it often requires as much ingenuity and insight to create them as solving the problem that they help you solve. And Nimbus was one of those scientific instruments. They can be software instruments or infrastructure instruments. They can have various different renditions these days. But today I'm going to talk about a particular scientific instrument called Chameleon. And this is a testbed for computer science research. And it's a project that was first funded in 2014. I was the PI of that project, and then there was a follow-on project that was funded in 2017. And just last year, we got another funding for 4 years for operating Chameleon for computer science experiments. And then I was also co-PI sub-ROD on many large projects, and I have to say that gave me a lot of insight into how to do things, because obviously those projects, some of them are more successful than others. So next slide. So a few words about Chameleon as a testbed for computer science research. So people working on networking problems, designing new operating systems, power management algorithms, and so forth. So of course, bare metal reconfigurable. We have a lot of interesting hardware. But one interesting point about that is that unlike infrastructures that came before us, we are built on top of a mainstream open source infrastructure called OpenStack, right? Most of you know it as something that deploys virtual machines. For us, it does bare metal reconfiguration, right? And doing that has many benefits, because first of all, it gives a platform that is familiar to both users and operators. And if it's not familiar, then they learn, right? So a lot of our summer students, we ask them what they learned during the summer. They say, I learned OpenStack. And that's great for them because they can put it on their resumes and things like that. But it also allows you to work with a development community that numbers in thousands, and development and reviewer community that numbers in thousands. And it allowed us to make a very large contribution to that project, right? We contributed what became a top-level component of OpenStack that does advanced reservations, right? So this is an achievement that, you know, many companies that pour millions of dollars into open source development would be proud of. And then finally, it also allows you to facilitate federation with other clouds, right? Because it implements standard cloud patterns like Cloud Init, but also because there are now many mainstream tools, right, that convert, for example, images between OpenStack and other clouds. So anyhow, many benefits. Just to finish, it has the testbed has thousands of users, and it's an open testbed. So if you have computer science project, research project, you can run on that. So next slide. So in terms of stakeholder alignment, one thing that I learned is, of course, running a successful project, large project, will require the cooperation of many stakeholders, and especially in science, unexpected things to happen. And when they do, there is what I call centrifugal forces, right? Everybody suddenly pulls in their own direction. And then telling people that they should get along is not very effective, right? Authentic collaboration comes from a sound structure of the project, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. But before I dive into that, in my view, best research is done when the need and opportunity collide, right? That means that you're going to have some stakeholders on the need side, and that's typically the larger community that adopts your product and whoever works with them, but then also on the opportunity side, and that's typically your team and their collaborators and maybe the advisory board and so forth. So with that, what are the principles that we were following in this project? Next slide. So the first one, of course, is developing a common vision. And this is very hard, right? It has to be on one hand innovative and ambitious, and on the other hand achievable and credible, and those are different things. But once you have it, you can be very successful, right? You drew a box around success, and if you manage to do that, everything else is easy. What is even harder, however, than coming up with common vision is getting started. Now, your project got funded, there's an empty space. How do you get your team behind you? And in software development, we've got something that we call minimum viable product, right? So it's a product of your research, should be baby version of your vision. It should be viable, right? So it should meet the need well in developing scientific instruments. That generally means that it's externally used. And it should be minimum, which means that it's none of the other things, right? It should be something that you can do in year one of the project. And there will be many challenges because people will be pulling apart. You will be taking on technical debt, and many people don't like doing that. But if you are successful in defining your MVPs, literally magic happens, right? All of a sudden, there is a focus for your collaboration. All of a sudden, everybody speaks the same language, and it really makes good use of your new project energy and propels you forward, right? And in Chameleon, that minimum viable project for us was a little bit rocky at first, actually. We, of course, defined the architecture, but between when we submitted the proposal and when the project got funded, something unexpected happened, and that was the OpenStack ironic, right? We had some plans in the proposal for how we were going to build the testbed, but ironic, the bare metal reconfiguration in OpenStack represented a huge opportunity for us. And of course, everybody pulled apart, right? Some people wanted to do this and the other people wanted to do that. And there was a lot of chatter. And so the question was, how can we unify the team behind a solution? And we decided to take 3 months of the project, do an evaluation, and answer the question that everybody was asking, such as, will this meet our architecture? Will this meet our requirements? Will this scale? If it doesn't meet things, will we be able to develop them ourselves? And in those 3 months, we answered all those questions, which meant it took us just another 3 months to actually release the minimum viable product and build the testbed, right? And we had everybody behind us, and the answer was not 0 or 1, right? It was not OpenStack or non-OpenStack. It was a mix of technologies, right? So this is when you invest the time in a considered answer, good things happen. Next slide. The second thing I would say, now that you know what you're building, it makes sense to build your team like you would build a house, right? So you know what your house looks like, who are the people, what are the areas of expertise that you need to engage? And I did a little tongue-in-cheek newspaper ad for Chameleon, right? If we were recruiting people for Chameleon, say, hey, there's this testbed to build, you're gonna be running crazy stuff, we need this, this, and that. The best way to then build your team is to engage people who would be doing what you want them to do anyways, right? In other words, if you think of Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? Make it work for you, make that invisible hand work for you. And then you have a sound structure with interests that work in your favor, right? It's always best if you know those people, and that's a good reason for networking. But sometimes if you do a project that's large enough or innovative enough, you will ultimately need areas of expertise where you might not know your stakeholders. Exploring synergies with other projects is always a good idea. For example, one of my co-PIs on Chameleon, Paul Ruth, he works on networking, works also on a project called Exogeny, which is a fantastic networking testbed. He was able to leverage and in some cases integrate some of the Exogeny capabilities into Chameleon, which means that we got outstanding capabilities for very low price, right? So the scientific community benefits, and not just capabilities, we got partnerships with Exogeny and all the leverage that comes from that, right? So it's fantastic if you can create those connections. But then, of course, always remember you're the foundation of the house, and you need to allocate the effort that it will take to bring everybody together. In software development, again, this is usually embodied by an architect with a strong integration team. Why do you need this integration team? Because when people develop software components, typically they are not quite completely to spec, right? So not only is it not always possible to specify absolutely everything, but what also happens is that unexpected things happen and things drift a little bit, right? So you need somebody to provide that glue. Next slide. And the final thing I would say is communication structure, and I think it really is summarized by when you work with people, tell them what to do and not how to do, right? They are experts. They are not contract programmers. This is not a small project when you need to do everything, right? You're now working with people who are independent actors, and they need both the ownership and the freedom of what to do. And then again, to give the example of how we do things on Chameleon, when I work with Paul on networking, for example, what happens is we jointly discuss what is needed, what experiments we want to support, and then he proposes how this is going to implement. Is that all? Of course, that is not all. Right now, it's my job to provide review and integrate that into the project, right? So we have the conversation where I say, if you do it this way, then maybe this experiment will become much harder to do. Can we do it this other way, right? I also have my team review what he does, because we're going to be integrating that into OpenStack, and that's no small task, right? So there is collaboration, there's a lot of give and take, but he leads, and he also gets the recognition of being the networking face of Chameleon. When you set up communication channels, I've seen on many projects that people get very excited about this, and to make sure that communication flows well, immediately create the hardware meeting, software meeting, systems meeting, management meeting, all hands meeting, and together with the daily scrum, that's generally considered sufficient, right? It will also, it's the weed that will kill the project, right? Because 8 people in a 1-hour meeting adds up to a full day of work, right? So I would say design your communication structure carefully to reflect what communication actually needs to flow on your project. And here, the what instead of how also helps, right? So I've got the example here of an email that that management list on the project gets every 2 weeks. And it summarizes various statistics on the project, including utilization and smoke test results and things like that. Sending that to people's mailboxes had a wonderful effect. All of a sudden, everybody on the project is much better informed, and even PIs who don't do operations are able to talk about project needs and what happens. But it also allows you to communicate. So structuring your communication in terms of metrics, in terms of vital stats of the project, allows you to say what instead of how, right? So you don't have to say, you need to fix your code or you need to fix your site. You say, those are the results of your smoke tests. Next slide. So those are sort of 3 principles that I use, that I find most helpful in building structured communication with my opportunity team. But then the question is, of course, who are you working for, right? So who are the people who need the results of what you're producing? And just yesterday, when I started thinking about who do I work for in Chameleon, I found 5 different communities. The first one is, of course, the most obvious. We work for our users, right? We work for researchers who need to run computer science systems experiments, and we work to enable their stuff. But if you can list other communities, that becomes a real multiplier of your impact, right? Because on your y-axis, this is just one value for one community. But if you can add x-axis, and on that x-axis you've got other communities, you suddenly, what you produce, what you design is worth much more. And the structural way of communicating with those communities is to adapt your product to their needs. And next slide to show, again, some examples from Chameleon. Next slide, yeah. So for users, we of course have a broad community with users. We started working with them before the first Chameleon proposal. So I did an informal survey of 20 research groups, and we keep in touch with them via various vehicles. But another interesting community that we work with is domain researchers. And for that community, we write papers about the testbed. And we provide traces from the testbed so that they can run their algorithms against them, right? So Just to say, next time you write your data management program, it's a great opportunity to see, can you engage another community via the data that your project produces? Then, of course, developers, I already talked about OpenStack contributions, but we use other bits of software. OpenStack at this point accounts for no more maybe than 50% of the system, and we work with those communities as well. Now, for testbed providers, other testbed providers, people who want to create another testbed or maybe add to the Chameleon testbed potentially on a part-time basis. Well, we had to take Chameleon infrastructure, and instead of operating it, we had to say, can we package it so that somebody else can take it and use it in their environment? And then finally, other resource providers, right? So Chameleon is incompatible with the way that resources are traditionally managed for domain scientists with the batch schedulers and so forth. Or is it? Maybe they can be used in conjunction. That's an interesting question. So we're right now working with OSG actively to answer that question and see to what extent they can work together. And then last slide, just to summarize, authentic and effective collaboration is the result of developing a sound structure around it, in my experience, right? A sound structure for the vision, how you implement the vision, that's a very important part of that, the team structure, but then also how you communicate with your team. And then working with the communities on the needs side of your project is a fantastic multiplier of your impact. If you can define many communities and then adapt your result or your product, or however you talk about what your project does to those different communities, then all of a sudden many more people can benefit from what you're doing. So that's all I have for today. I'll take questions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Keehee. So of course, as I put in the chat, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A tab for Dr. Keehee and indicate its question for her. I have a quick question just to start. First of all, I just want to, I love the quote that you put on the top of one of your slides where you said, your project is a conversation with people whose lives it will change, right? That really gets to the heart of, I think, a lot of what we're trying to promote here in this set of sessions. But you talked a little bit about the metrics as a medium for this communication. And next week is our session on metrics. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about how you get at the perspectives of your stakeholders, right? What are their interests? And then maybe how you translate that to appropriate metrics.
Yeah. Well, so I think that this depends very much on the community. And in many cases, this is not the sort of thing where you come in with metrics that are already defined or things that are already defined. You have to, it means going there and listening. And very often what you hear is not what you expected. So it's a question of being open to that. So in terms of users, like I said, before the proposal, so I'm a computer scientist myself, right? So I represent that dash of need that I think is a vital ingredient of every project. But when we were interviewing the various research groups about their needs, I learned a lot of stuff, right? So different people work on different types of research, but also different people do things differently. And I learned about things that, I wasn't thinking at the beginning, right? People's interest in reproducibility, for example, a lot of data projects had needs that did not occur to me. So, it's important to have this respectful attitude to requirements of others and engage very actively, right? You can't really start with metrics in that sense. Now later on, showing some quantitative and qualitative results to the people that you're engaging with is very useful, I think. Right. So we made, for example, available on our website the publications from our community. That was per request of the community. People wanted to say, I want to know what kinds of papers people write on Chameleon, because then I know that I can do something similar, right? So generally speaking, people go by example. And then, of course, I have never seen a scientist who was able to resist a graph. So those graphs themselves are a form of engagement, right? People will look at them and say, and why is this way? And is there a problem? Can I solve the problem? And how can I solve the problem?
Right, thank you. So we have a number of questions online, and I'll go through them as they come up into the amount that we have time. So one of those questions was, can you share some best practices for how you recruit and retain top software development talent in an educational lab setting, considering that there are often commercial opportunities for them that are more lucrative?
So this is a very good question, and I would love to know the answer. Well, to that, I mean, obviously, to some extent, I do that. Though I do have to say, it's extremely difficult, especially in the field of cloud computing, which is obviously a very hot cloud right now. I think that many people, some of the factors that make us successful. So first of all, it's not that different from recruiting partners on your project. You have to have a compelling vision. You have to have something cool that you're working on that will attract people. I think that the academic environment has the advantage over industry that in many cases, the path to result is much faster and much shorter. You don't go the winding path of a large corporation and the overhead that goes with it. In many cases, individuals can make direct impact. So a lot of the people on my team are people who are interested in working with scientists directly. And like I said, the science itself, either compelling vision of your project, you're doing something cool, right? So we're developing a very crazy test bed, right? There is a lot of opportunity for doing interesting stuff, attracts them, but then also the people whose lives they are changing, right? So on Chameleon, we've got some fantastic scientists creating innovative solutions. Every month, we publish a blog about some experiment or some paper that a user published. Computer scientists and developers are interested in that, right? Hey, there's this new breakthrough in biometrics, and it happened on our testbed. I think that's probably the main thing. And then, of course, people are also interested in contributing to open source, for example. That's an important venue, which if you work in industry, you very often don't have the opportunity to do that, right? Or at least it's not as obvious as in academia.
If I could, though, I know, Nick, you have more questions, but Kate, the other thing is that you are an educational institution. And so the fact that people are being hired from industry is a product in itself. And so you are generating talent. And you probably have now an alumni base that's out there in the world.
I think that you're right. There is a little bit of that. And especially if you work with students, I think that there's a potential for many of them to become your team members eventually, right? And that very often happens in academia as well.
Yeah, great. And just a little commercial, we do have a workforce session coming up in a few weeks. And even with metrics, we're going to talk a little bit about this so those interested in human resource issues and especially in computing. This is something we see whenever we talk to science enterprises is lamenting the loss of their star people to industry, right? So that is a topic we've played with quite a bit.
Yeah. It is hard. I've got a position open right now if somebody out there wants to apply.
There you go. Good.
I've had that position open for some time. So I think especially during the pandemic, people complain about the economy, but the fact of the matter is that tech jobs are hot right now, and that whole economy is very hot.
So we have a number of questions about the MVP, the product you mentioned, but let's just do the first question because I think that can kind of encapsulate other ones. If you develop the MVP before recruiting users, don't you miss the opportunity to incorporate user input in the development of MVP?
I think so. The answer to that question is we do talk to users before developing MVP, and that's the right way to do things, right? So when I mentioned that I did all those interviews with the user community, with research groups, who were going to be the recipients of our product effectively. That's what we were doing. We were engaging users in developing the central vision. Right now, the vision gets boiled down to the MVP, and at that point, you have to have a good understanding of what at least some core constituency of users want. Right, so it's very, very important. Like I said, also, each project that builds anything, especially a scientific instrument, should have a dash of stakeholders on the need side, right? At least a dash of stakeholders on the need side. They could be early adopters, but I think that the minimum viable product should be adopted outside of the project, right? Because it's easy to become inbred, so to speak, right? So to build for yourself, to build for your partners, and then you might find out that those needs don't scale to others, right? So it's very often a trade-off between engaging a large community of users or large enough so that your minimum viable product can be a product, right? So have all the features that are needed, and engaging them in a viable way.
Right. So Joel, we have time for another question still.
Sure.
All right. How about here's one from an anonymous attendee. What has changed in your proposals for Chameleon that has improved your research given the multiple submissions over time? Is there a kind of figure or chart that may change but typically appears? I'm not sure what that second part means, but
okay.
What lessons did you learn as you evolved your large project? Yeah.
So I think, I understood actually the question a little bit differently. Where I understood it, how the product evolved, right? But I can answer. I'll be happy to answer both. So the first Chameleon proposal, the first 3 years, we were focused on essentially building the basic platform for Chameleon, right? And the community there we were addressing were users, right? So we built our MVP, but then the MVP probably satisfied maybe 80% of the experiments that Chameleon does today, but not very well, right? So it was hard to use. We were, throughout that first phase, we were making it better. In the second Chameleon proposal, the second phase, we continued to improve the platform, make it better and satisfy even more experiments, but we also did something different. We said, now we have built a community of experimenters. Now we have effectively an equivalent of a watering hole where, it's like a watering hole in the desert when the animals come for the test bed. Can we now stretch to make an impact on experimental methodology and reproducibility for that community? And we started developing various reproducibility mechanisms, right? So in a sense, we were addressing a higher level need. And then in the third phase, so we're continuing with those two thrusts, but we're also really looking at different communities, at multiplying our impact by adapting the product to other needs, right? So we're looking at, in particular, we're working with OSG. We're looking at the community of potential other testbed developers and packaging our system better, right? So all those things require effort, but we're also looking at broadening the set of experiments. And a particular area of interest is adding edge devices to the system so that people can run experiments in the edge to cloud continuum. And we're expecting to have a minimum viable product for that after the summer, right? So there will be those new capabilities.
And by the way, OSG is Open Science Grid.
Oh, Open Science. I'm so sorry. This is yes. It's so easy to get into your context and forget that yes, acronyms always need to be expanded. Thank you.
Great. And Joel, how are we on time? Are we?
I think, well, first of all, maybe we might all join in a virtual applause for Kate for really taking us through a wonderful journey. I see lots of hands coming up. So great appreciation for really not only showing us how you broadened impacts by broadening the definition of stakeholders, but how the science itself has evolved as you then looked at the needs and interests of those broader communities. So thank you for taking us on that journey. Really, really much deeply appreciated.
Thank you so very much. And I should say, if you have any questions and they were not answered, feel free to email me directly. I'll be happy to engage over email.
Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful. So Joel, we're going to get on to another exercise here today, right? And we did an exercise last time, and we had, of course, hundreds and hundreds of people on. So we're going to do it again. But there are some things we learned. And what I'd like to do is point out that as we do this exercise, one thing we found over the years working with scientists, and I briefly mentioned this last time, is that oftentimes when you get together in a workshop, the time at the having coffee and the breaks where you speak to each other about the topic at hand is quite fulfilling. Oftentimes it's some of your favorite time in a session. So the reason we have these breakout sessions are, of course, to play around and digest some of the ideas we have, but also to meet each other and expand your networks. So we're going to be doing breakout sessions again today. The thing we are going to ask you to do is think through your stakeholders, but when we do, there are a couple of things I want to bring to your attention. The first is the distinction in the first half of this session where we talked about positions, interests, and then value propositions. A position is something someone wants. I want to be on your publication is the example we gave. But then the question is why, right? After someone states a position, you might ask why, and that's their interest. Well, it's because I want a promotion, because I want the status associated with more publications. I want to be acknowledged for my efforts, right? So you get at the interests that underlie the position. And then once you understand the interests, that's when you can really sometimes articulate that value proposition. So the value propositions usually go around what we called in the last session our 4 dimensions of impact. And some of the feedback we got on the 4 dimensions of impact, of course, being scientists and engineers, are what's the precise definition and give, right? The idea of this, and there are precise definitions, but that's not our goal. Our goal is to use these 4 as thought starters, because they are not mutually exclusive. There are ways to frame similar efforts along, say, science and workforce, for example. So the idea is not to be too nitpicky, as in a checklist that I have to go over each of these. Rather, these 4 dimensions of impact are a way to get us thinking. They're thought aids as we think through our value proposition for any particular stakeholder. Are they interested in my science? How can my science impact them? Are they interested in some workforce issues, right? Innovation, is it new technologies that they're interested in? Are they interested in startups, right? Things that are done new. Or are they interested in dollars? Is it pretty straight that they want to see a return, ROI, in terms of dollars, right? So we want you to keep in mind these 4 dimensions of impact. We want you to keep in mind the positions, interest, and value propositions. And then what we're going to do is form breakout groups. Now, keep in mind, when you go to your session, so if we could go to the next slide, this will be what we're doing. When you go to the next session, you will go to a Zoom room first. You will go to your Zoom rooms. That'll be a lot of people. And then from there, you will be assigned. So you have to click to go to your Zoom rooms, and we'll tell you how to do that. Once you're in your Zoom room, you wait a minute. That'll be a big group of people. And then from there, you'll go to smaller breakout groups. These breakout rooms, the idea is to do a quick round of introductions. Now, we are all very accomplished researchers with a lot of interest, so I encourage each of you to be fairly quick with your introduction, right? Simply, and then someone very quickly agree to be a scribe. And here is a link to a Google Doc where that scribe can, take some notes.
And it will be posted in the chat in the meeting room that you're going to.
Yeah, it'll be posted in your chat. So that's what you do. And we'd like to go around quickly. Now, last time, and be mindful of time. We all have a lot to say. Try to hold your comments, be a bit efficient with your comments. But this is what we're going to do. You're going to go through stakeholders, and we've given you some, and you can use the stakeholders that we provide, and then just think, pick a stakeholder or 2 and identify and discuss the stakeholder. Put yourself in their shoes. The first stakeholder we put here is a U.S. congressperson. A U.S. congressperson, all of a sudden, when you're at a large level of a project, you get the scrutiny of, say, congresspeople. What is in it? What's the congressperson's stake in your large project, right? Put yourself in their shoes. Think through what a science enterprise at a large level means to that congressperson. What are their positions? What are their interests? And what kind of value proposition might you offer? And, you know, play around with talking, and then pick any, and we give you a list of stakeholders here. You could pick 1 or 2 to go over. Your scribe should take notes. We're going to have exactly 20 minutes, and then we'll bring you back. Now, again, when it's over, you're going to be automatically put into that Zoom room. Then you're going to have to manually go back to the platform and come back to this session, and then we'll wrap up and set up next week's session on measurement and metrics.
So just to
this is what you're going to do.
What
Go
Nick
ahead,
is
Joe.
saying, you are now in the main session. And by the way, the reason we have these separate meeting rooms, when we did this, 1,500 people signed up. And what we learned is that the maximum breakout rooms possible with a Zoom account is 50. And so if all of you, everyone who signed up showed up, we would not have enough breakout rooms. So we had to set up 5 separate Zoom meetings, each of which can have up to 50 breakout rooms. And that's why we have this 2-step process. So we apologize for that confusion, but we literally ran up against the limits of the technology. So again, you'll leave here by your birthday and go to one of the 5 meeting rooms. And in that room, there'll be a lot of people. You don't have to do anything, just pause for a minute. There'll be in the chat a link to the shared Google Doc, which you can click on. But the person who is the host in that meeting room will then further break you out into groups of about 4 or 5 people. So Nick, any final word?
That's it. But just that, you know, as far as the scribe goes, just please volunteer quickly and get through the introductions quickly. And we look forward to seeing you in 20 minutes.
But for those of you who are back, welcome back. You, of course, are now an accomplished navigator of multiple platforms. It is possible that in future sessions, depending on the numbers, we may be able to do it all on one Zoom platform, which will be a lot less complicated. But thank you. Thank you for rejoining. What we wanted to do is go back to the survey questions that we asked you after the last session about stakeholder alignment. And one of the questions we asked you was, if you could use a phrase or a metaphor to summarize your vision of stakeholder alignment, what would it be? A number of you had phrases saying that with stakeholder alignment, research is transformative. It will surface differences in values and metrics. It will create a community of practice. So you had views that were consistent with what we heard from our keynote. And of course, some of you had images. Is this like a symphony? Is it like rowing together? We've talked about herding cats, but you pointed out this is cats and dogs. And in a sense, it's transformational or metamorphosis. So those were some of the things that you said as to what you had in mind with stakeholder alignment. John, you want to say a little bit about the additional comments that people had? You're muted.
After all this time, I'm still learning. People have varied views of what happens with the process of stakeholder alignment. And if it were easy to do, if people just naturally fell into the habit of doing it, we wouldn't even be having to discuss it. But it's actually hard to do. It's hard to get people with different views to come together and share their views.
And so, needless to say, a lot of these quotes were things that you said that signal that. You also had some comments just about logistics, pasting things in chat, which we're now doing, having a summary in advance of what to expect, putting up the slides before the session, making sure the keynote speakers will be available. And these are all things that we are doing based on your feedback. So these pre-session surveys are helping us to further align the process and even the substance with your needs.
So in the next 3 sessions, we're going to deal with measurement. We're going to look a little bit at metrics. Nick's going to kind of take the lead on that. We're going to talk about leadership, what is necessary to be a large leader, and data management. We're also going to talk about workforce and so forth.
Good. And I don't know whether Nick or Susan, you've been able to look at the shared Google Doc to see anything that you might want to report out from that. But I think the important thing to say, as John said at the beginning, is that we're building starting with stakeholders into then measuring impacts, and then this whole idea of enterprise leadership, data management. And we always will do just the next 3 sessions to look ahead. But as John indicated, workforce is coming. But our goal is to really think of this as a full large-scale enterprise that you're leading. Do we have any sense of what people came from in terms of the views that were expressed on the different stakeholders that they talked about in their breakouts?
Haven't had a chance to look at it yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance as well. Susan, have you had a chance to look at the
All right, I'm sorry. So what we'll do is at the next session, we'll report some of what we saw, and we hope to, of course, help you to learn from the collective experience across all the groups. But before we break, we're just a minute away. The last thing that I guess I'd like to share with you is the notion that as stakeholders, the folks that you are identifying for your future research are folks who have views that aren't what you want, but it's what they want. And I really want to lift up what we heard from Kate, which is the way she achieved broader impacts. One of the 2 NSF criteria was by thinking of additional stakeholder categories that literally broaden the impact by bringing them into the conversation. And so it's not as though there's a prescribed list of who are the stakeholders for a given project. It's actually a creative opportunity for you to say, are there other lives that my work might be relevant to? And how do I get their voices into the conversation? And this is the really exciting part, when you do, it can actually change the science and engineering itself. So we're delighted to have you with us for this 2nd in 7 series. Today was a deep dive on stakeholder alignment. Thank you very much.